Hello, students, and welcome to Finance for Engineers course. Today, we are going to start fifth unit, which is concerning to long-term financing. By the title, it is very clear that this unit will cover various long-term financing sources available to the business organization. Till this unit, you must have understood that finance is the lifeblood of business concern because it is interlinked with all activities performed by the business firm. Quantum of finance may be depending upon the nature and situation of the business firm. Sources of finance means the ways for mobilizing various terms of finance to the industrial concern. Various terms mean period, that is long term, medium term, or short term. Sources of finance helps us to know how the companies are mobilizing finance for their requirements. The company, whether existing or the new, need some amount of finance to meet the long-term and short-term requirements, such as purchasing of fixed assets, construction of office building, purchase of raw materials, and day-to-day expenses, etc. Financial requirement of the business differs from firm to firm, and the nature of the requirements on the basis of terms or period of financial requirement. It may be long term and short term financial requirement. Let us start with the introduction. In case of proprietary and partnership concern, the funds may be raised either from personal sources or borrowing from the bank, friends, etc. But in case of companies whose financial requirement is rather large, have to raise funds from various available long-term financing sources. When the finance mobilized with large amount and the repayable over the period will be more than 5 years, it may be considered as long-term sources. Share capital, issue of debenture, long-term loans from financial institutions and commercial banks come under this kind of source of finance. Long-term source of finance needs to meet the capital expenditure of the firms, such as purchase of fixed assets, land and building, etc. Long-term financial requirement is also called as fixed capital requirement. Thus, it can be said that the long-term sources fulfill the financial requirements of an enterprise for a period exceeding 5 years and include sources such as shares and debentures, long-term borrowing, and loan from financial institutions, etc. Such financing is generally required for the acquisition of fixed assets such as purchase of an equipment, plant, etc. Next is long-term sources of finance include shares, debentures or bonds, loan capital, foreign capital, FDI, euro issues, venture capital. Thus, a business firm can raise funds from various sources. Each of the source has its unique characteristic which must be properly understood so that the best available source of raising funds can be identified. There is not a single best source of funds for all organizations depending on the situation, purpose, cost, and associated risk. A choice may be made about the source to be used. For example, if a business wants to raise funds for meeting fixed capital requirements, long-term funds may be required, which can be raised in the form of owned funds or borrowed funds. Next, let us start with shares. Issue of shares is the main source of long-term finance. Shares are issued by joint stock companies to the public. The capital obtained by issue of shares is known as share capital. The capital of a company is divided into small units called as shares. Each share, each share has its nominal value. For example, a company can issue 1 lakh shares of rupees 10 each for a total value of rupees 10 lakh. A person holding shares is called a shareholder. There are two types of shares normally issued by a company. These are equity shares and preference shares. The money raised by issue of equity shares is called equity share capital, while the money raised by issue of preference shares is called preference share capital. So let us see what is equity shares. Equity shares are also called as ordinary shares. Ordinary shares provide ownership rights to the investors. They are the real owners of the company. They have a control over the management of the company. Equity shareholders are eligible to get dividend if the company earns profit. Equity share capital cannot be redeemed during the lifetime of the company. That means it don't have any maturity period. The liability of equity shareholder is the value of unpaid value of shares. Equity share is the most important source for raising long-term capital by a company. It represents the ownership of company and thus the capital raised by issue of such share is known as ownership capital or owner's fund. Equity share capital is a prerequisite to the creation of a company. Let us see features of equity share. First is maturity of shares. Equity shares have permanent nature of capital. That means it don't have any maturity period as such. Therefore, it cannot be redeemed during the lifetime of the company. Next is residual claim on income. That means equity shareholders have the right to get income left after paying fixed rate of dividend to preference shareholders. The earnings or the income available to the shareholders is equal to the profit after tax minus preference dividend. Next is residual claims on assets. If the company wound up, that means it shut down its business, then the ordinary or equity shareholders have the right to get the claims on assets. These rights are only available to the equity shareholders. Next is right to control. Equity shareholders are the real owners of the company. Hence, they have power to control the management of the company, and they have power to take any decision regarding the business operation. Next is voting rights. These shareholders have voting rights in the meeting of the company. With the help of these rights, that is voting right, they can change or remove any decision of the business concern. Equity shareholders have voting rights in the meeting, and they also can nominate proxy to participate and vote in the meeting instead of the shareholder. By voting, they can elect their representative on a board of directors who are responsible for taking important decisions concerned with development or growth of the business. Next is preemptive right. Equity shareholders have preemptive right. Preemptive right is the legal right of the existing shareholders. It is attested by the company in the first opportunity to purchase additional equity shares in proportion to their current holding capacity. That means if the company wish to issue additional shares in the market, then the company should first give preference to the existing shareholders and then to the other general public. Next is limited liability. Equity shareholders have limited liability. That means the value of shares they have purchased. If the shareholders are having fully paid up shares, they have no liability. That means, for example, if shareholder purchased 100 shares with the face value of rupees 10 each and he paid only rupees 900, then his liability is only rupees 100. Liability of shareholder is only concerned with unpaid value of the share, that is rupees 100, which he has not yet paid. So this is concerned with limited liability. So these are the important features of equity shares. Next is advantages of equity shares. Equity shares are the most common and universally used shares to mobilize finance for the company. It consists of following advantages. First is permanent source of finance. Equity share capital is belonging to long-term permanent nature of sources of finance. Hence, it can be used for long-term or fixed capital requirement of the business concern. Also, it is to be repaid only at the time of liquidation of a company, as it stands last in the list of claims. It provides a cushion for creditors in the event of winding up of company. Second is voting rights. Equity shareholders are the real owners of the company who have voting rights. This type of advantage is available only to the equity shareholders. Democratic control over management of the company is assured due to voting rights available to the equity shareholders. Third, no fixed dividend. Equity shares do not create any obligation to pay a fixed rate of dividend. If the company earns profit, equity shareholders are eligible for profit. They are eligible to get dividend otherwise, and they cannot claim any dividend from the company. Next is less cost of capital. Cost of capital is the major factor which affects the value of a company. If the company wants to increase the value of company, they have to use more share capital, as it consists of less cost of capital when compared with the other sources of finance. So these are certain advantages of equity share. Now the next is disadvantages of equity share. First is irredeemable. Equity shares cannot be redeemed during the lifetime of the business concern. It is the most dangerous thing of over capitalization. That means it may affect on the capitalization of the business firm. Second is obstacles in management. Equity shareholder can put obstacles in management by manipulation and organizing themselves, because they have power to contrast any decisions which are against the welfare of the shareholders. Next is leads to speculation. Equity shares dealing in share market lead to specularism during prosperous periods. And the last one is limited income to investors. The investors who desire to invest in safe securities with a fixed income have no attraction for equity shares. Now, the next source of raising long term finance is preference share. This is the another type of shares that are issued by the company for raising long term capital. The capital raised by issue of preference share is called preference share capital. Preference shares are the shares which carry preferential rights over the equity shares. These rights are first, receiving a fixed rate of dividend out of the net profit of the company before any dividend is declared for equity shareholders. Second is getting back the capital in case the company is wound up. Investment in these shares are safe and a preference shareholder also gets dividends regularly. In other words, as compared to the equity shareholders, the preference shareholders have a preferential claim over the dividend and repayment of capital. Next is features of preference shares. The following are the important features of preference shares. First is maturity period. Normally, preference shares have no fixed maturity period except in case of redeemable preference shares. Preference shares can be redeemable only at the time of company liquidation. Second is residual claim on income. Preferential shareholders have a residual claim on income. Fixed rate of dividend is payable to the preference shareholders. Next is residual claim on asset. The first preference is given to the preference shareholders at the time of liquidation. If any extra assets are available that should be distributed to equity shareholders, in that case, preference shareholders will not have any claim on the extra asset. Next is control of management. Preference shareholder does not have any voting right, hence they cannot have control over the management of the company. Next is advantages of preference share. Preference shares have the following important advantages. First, fixed dividend. The dividend rate is fixed in case of preference shares. It is called as fixed income security because it provides a constant rate of income to the investors. Second is cumulative dividend. Preference shares have another advantage which is called cumulative dividend. That means if the company does not earn any profit in any previous years, it can be get accumulated with future period dividend. Next is redemption. Preference shares can be redeemable after a specific period, except in the case of irredeemable preference shares. There is a fixed maturity period for repayment of the initial investment. Next, participation. Participative preference shareholders can participate in the surplus profit after distribution to the equity shareholders. Finally, convertibility. Convertibility is with the preference shares, which gives right to the preference shareholders to get it converted into equity share, but Articles of Association should provide such provision in it. So these are various advantages of preference shares. And the next point is disadvantages of preference shares. First is expensive source of finance. Preference shares have high expensive source of finance while compared to equity share. Second, no voting right. Generally, preference shareholders do not have any voting right, hence, they cannot have the control over the management of the company. Third, fixed dividend only. Preference shares can get only fixed rate of dividend. They may not enjoy more profits of the company. Next is permanent burden. Cumulative preference shares become a permanent burden so far as the payment of dividend is concerned because the company must pay the dividend for the unprofitable periods also. Next is taxation. In the taxation point of view, preference share dividend is not a deductible expense while calculating tax. Hence, it has disadvantage on the tax deduction point of view. So students, here I'm ending my session. In next session, we will continue with the preference shares and other long-term sources of finance. Thank you.